How do we make sense to ourselves? By what mechanism can we interpret who we are and what it means to project ourselves into the world through our actions? Well, Lacan says one of the important ways that we do this is through language. And Lacan is very important in the history of philosophy because we're seeing the importance in philosophy of language in the early to mid 20th century making its way into psychoanalysis, where Lacan is going to make the assertion that the unconscious is like a language. Indeed, it is a language of its own. However, it is a language which must necessarily otherize itself through being spoken. Thereby it is derided, moved past, barred, and as such we have a terrible paradox ahead of us. How do we interpret the unconscious except through language? And through the uttering of that language, we necessarily undermine that language of the unconscious. Thus, Lacan places an incredible importance on the signifier, which he says that the unconscious, the id, is a signifier. Now, this language might seem weird to some people, but it's coming from essentially semiotics and Saussurean linguistics. You have a signifier and you have a signified. In the case of, for example, my book, Ecrits here, the signifier would be the word signifier, and the signified would be this object here, which it's supposed to refer to. Now, of course, there are all sorts of interpretations within semiotics about how does meaning come about through this process of signification? How can we know if there are pure signifiers in and of themselves, or whether they are necessarily kind of always elided through speech and whatnot? And Lacan is definitely privy to this latter position, that we are always essentially emptying signification through its utterance, and thus we have a very careful dialectic that has to be done, by which we are essentially finding the nothingness of the language of the unconscious, because it's subjective, so it has yet to be objectified into the world, a la the master-slave dialectic. And we have to try to find it before its objectification into speech. Lacan writes, "The unconscious is the chapter of my history that is marked by a blank or occupied by a lie. It is the censored chapter. But the truth can be refound. Most often it has already been written elsewhere, namely in monuments such as my body, the structure of my language, and it can be destroyed if we're not careful to maintain it. Also through my style of life, through my traditions, through my legends, and also through my neuroses, my phantasms, my sort of perversions of my mind that externalize themselves to try to deal with repression and guilt and things like this." As such, Lacan is trying to manipulate and discover the undercurrents of this incredibly complicated language, which is the language of the unconscious and desire. Now, I'm going to be working through some different sections of Ecrits to hopefully give you an idea of what Lacan means by the unconscious being a language. Because it's undoubtedly sure that Lacan is representing kind of this apex of linguistic reductionism. What is the most true, and this is kind of Platonic in certain senses. For Plato, what was most true is the ideal, because the ideal are the forms which are eternal, they're unmoving, and we can only sort of kind of approach them through dialectics. But we're always, doing dialectics via particulars, via things which are not the truth as they actually are. There are certain ranges of opinion that are breaching closer and closer to the truth of the forms. And in the same way, Lacan sees the truth of the unconscious, which is essentially the language of the signifier, the way in which that is then realized through speech. This is essentially what is the most true about what we are. Now, it's important to note, of course, that The underbelly of what we are is not something solid. In fact, it's a void for Lacan. The subject is essentially eliding his own nothingness, trying to fill himself by projecting himself into the future. This is very similar to what Heidegger has to say about Dasein and being towards death. What we do is we're always trying to figure out what we are. And one of the things about being a Dasein is that you are necessarily thrown into a world in which you try to make sense of yourself by inevitably reaching a point where you die, where you cease to be that self anymore and that self is no longer recoverable. So we're always trying to find ourselves out amidst the fact that we cannot universalize ourselves. We are a particular confined to a particular space in the world, and we have to negotiate our place in that world through the continual negotiation of what it means to be who we are. As such, to make sense of ourselves and to make sense to our own selves is always to project ourselves in front of ourselves and learn how we elicit a response in the world. As such, Lacan recognizes that the unconscious is going to be obeying certain syntactic or grammatical rules. In the same way that language can only allow certain phonemes to be in certain places, certain subjects and predicates to work in certain ways within a sentence, and this is going to change depending on the level of inflection in the language, the extent to which it requires a rigid sentence structure or whether it's more dynamic and kind of much more up to the whims of the speaker. Lacan recognizes that this is how the unconscious works. It's bound by certain rules. It must objectify itself in certain ways. Because if you think back to the previous lecture that I did on the mirror stage, the subject essentially knows itself through its otherization, which is to say through its alienation, through its being thrown out of itself and then trying to recursively come back and try to find itself through its already alienated state. This is, as you can see, a very convoluted process, and near the end I'm going to give us a particularly convoluted quote to kind of sum up what this situation means. But one of the problems here is that, a la the master-slave dialectic, the subject can only be realized through his objectification into the world, which means that he necessarily becomes an object for his or herself. As such, this process of objectification is precisely how the subject is able to operate in the world. Its unconscious desires are filtered, and there is a bar between the unconscious and the conscious is how we actually make decisions. This is where, the will lies and whatnot. This is how we are able to look at the stuff that's in front of us and deliberate about it and make decisions about it. So the unconscious obeys certain syntactical or grammatical rules that one uses to interpret objective manifestations of the unconscious qua masked, Because the unconscious is always being masked by the way it appears as the conscious, and thus the classic proclivity within the psychoanalytic tradition to always be wary of the manifest content. We're always looking for the latent content of, for example, dreams in Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Everything is always a symbol for something deeper, and we'll see how that plays into, for example, primary versus secondary languages for Lacan. But as such, these grammatical rules mean that, as he says, interpretation is not grounded in some assumption of divine archetypes, but rather in the fact that the unconscious has the radical structure of a language, and that a material operates in the unconscious according to certain laws. So the great question is, how do we figure out what those laws are? Now, it's important that we make the differentiation between language and speech. Now, this is something that I have my problems with, but I'm going to give it to you as Lacan gives it to you. You have language over here, which is essentially an ideal construct. This is the signifier in and of itself before its mediation through its own objectification, which is through speech. Speech is the way where we take the language in here and we utter it and we make it real. Now, of course, the problem is and this is something that most philosophers of language know, I can never say what I really mean. Because what I really mean is basically an abstraction. I can only mean what I appear to mean through coming on the scene a la speech. So Lacan says that we always come back to our twofold reference to speech and language. In order to free the subject's speech, we introduce him to the language of his desire. That is, to the primary language in which, beyond what he tells us of himself, he is already speaking to us unbeknownst to himself. First and foremost, in the symbols of his symptom. Right? So this is why Lacan privileges things like phantasms and neuroses and hallucinations and false images and stuff like this. These are symptoms in ways in which the unconscious appears as the conscious. And of course, there's always conflict between the unconscious and the conscious. Therefore, he says, it is certainly a language that is at stake in the symbolism brought to light in analysis. This language, corresponding to the playful wish found in one of Lichtenberg's aphorisms, has the universal character of a tongue that would be understood in all other tongues. But at the same time, since it is a language that grabs hold of desire at the very moment it becomes humanized by gaining recognition, it is absolutely partial and particular to the subject. It is thus a primary language, by which I do not mean a primitive language. Right? What he's saying here is that desire is the primary language of the unconscious. It is the more primordial language, and it is particular to the subject. It is something that really only I can know about myself, and that thus the point of the analyst in psychoanalysis is to get the subject to recognize himself as his own other. That's what Lacan says. So what we're doing is we're trying to recognize the own laws by which our unconscious works and makes itself manifest. That way we can project ourselves into the future as we would like. And of course, the problem here is that we're always sort of projecting ourselves in front of ourselves and trying to play catch-up, of course. But this primary language is what Lacan is most concerned about. This is the language of the unconscious versus the language qua speech. Now, anyone that's been in a stressful situation or a very vulnerable situation knows that language is a primary way by which we come to know ourselves. If I fail a test and I start calling myself an idiot, and I'm like, man, you're stupid, that is going to start kind of reciprocally recreating my self-image. The ways in which, for example, I come to be named is one of the primary ways by which I understand and recognize myself in a social circle. When my name is uttered by someone else, I am thrust into that social situation. I'm confronted with my own subjectivization through my own otherness to myself. And thus my job is, how am I able to deal with that? And how am I able to kind of not suppress the fact that I am not exactly who I want to be, and that I am, to some extent, succumbing to the whims of others. And thus we have a very particular situation by which language constitutes the subject by objectifying him and thereby eliciting a response from the other. Through the world, through other people I'm in conversations with, through my peers and things like that. Lacan says the function of language and speech is not to inform, but to evoke. This is very similar to Deleuze and Guattari's theory of language in the Postulates of Linguistics chapter in 1,000 Plateaus. They say that language is not about information or communication. It's about negotiating power and identity and eliciting a response in the real world. And they mention, for example, order words, mot d'ordre, I think in the French, whereby which, for example, a judge proclaims someone guilty, and this speech act creates the reality that it is supposedly referring to. The reality comes up on the scene after the fact. Thus, this is how language is actually constituting the subject, because, for example, through the ways in which you are taught your own name is how you build up your sense of individuality. As you're a child growing up, you're just kind of doing things on instinct, and you're slowly gaining the cognitive abilities to, for example, recognize object permanence, recognize self-permanence through the mirror stage, as we talked about in my last lecture, and my sense of individuality, right? So language otherizes the subject through his symbolic projection. I use language as a symbol of myself to cause myself to come onto the scene in the world, and this is where I become markedly social. And I am eliciting a response from someone else, because this is basically what Hegel's master-slave dialectic is saying, that the subject needs the recognition, that is, the response from the other in order to be a subject at all. In order to have permanence in the world is to be reflected back in that world, which of course elicits imagery of the mirror stage. He says that the function of language in speech is not to inform, but to evoke. And what I seek in speech is a response from the other. What constitutes me as a subject is my question, right? Which is to say, the ways in which I speak into the world and expect a certain response back. In order to be recognized by the other, I prefer what was only in view of what will be. In order to find him, I call him by a name that he must assume or refuse in order to answer me, right? If I say, for example, when are you going to stop cheating on your wife? This is a phrase which very overtly has some expected assumptions that the other can either acquiesce to, or they can deny the terms upon which my utterance is based, right? Because if I say, I'm never going to, or I'm always going to, right? When are you going to stop cheating on your wife assumes that you've been cheating on your wife. So you either participate in that and thereby get subjected to my presuppositions, or we're at this impasse where you cannot respond and reciprocate me. So the great challenge, of course, is that we need our own assumptions about ourselves to be recognized by essentially linguizing ourselves. That's a made-up term, right? But we are using language and the utterance through speech to prefer and elicit a response which we are trying to expect. We're trying to manipulate the other, but we're trying to do this in a way where they will participate in our game. Lacan further says, I identify myself in language, but only by losing myself in it as object. Right? This is, for example, you hear your name in a conversation, or you say your own name. You are suddenly cast out into the world, and you recognize that that name can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What is recognized in my history is neither the past definite as what was, since it is no more, nor even the perfect as what has been in what I am, but the future anterior as what I will have been, given what I am in the process of becoming, right? This is the super tricky and conceptually impossible situation in which the speech act steps out in front of the reality it supposedly refers to, and it retroactively creates that reality which is supposedly its ground. This is something that Foucault and Judith Butler have talked about when it comes to, for example, gender identity or sexual identity, right? Now, Lacan is kind of weird because sometimes he will use this markedly Christian symbolism or language in order to get across his point. I'm really not knowledgeable enough on Lacan to know how he stands in terms of religion, but he uses this analogy of the Word made flesh, which of course is, God made flesh through his incarnation in Jesus. And he writes that psychoanalytic experience has rediscovered in men the imperative of the word as the law that has shaped him in its image. It exploits the poetic function of language to give his desire its symbolic mediation. May this experience finally enable you to understand that the whole reality of its effects lies in the gift of speech. For it is through this gift that all reality has come to man, and through its ongoing action that he sustains reality. Now, of course, you can really see his linguistic reductionism coming to the fore, that everything is at its most fundamental, everything that is most real to us is essentially linguistic. And language is the way by which words, which is the language of the unconscious, our desire, is made flesh. It's the way in which it is made real through its utterance, through its declaration, and through the response it elicits. Now, what does this mean for self-identity? We have all this talk today about recognizing and finding one's authentic self, being authentically me. And Lacan is very wary of this because it assumes some stable underlying selfhood. But Lacan essentially locates the self in its social otherization through the necessity, like Aristotle has said, that humans are political beings, or as Marx says, that we are social beings, right? We are necessarily embodied in the world, and we must struggle with the fact that that entails a constant, proactive uttering into the world ahead of ourselves, such that we realize ourselves ahead of ourselves and must figure out how to negotiate this. And here's a very convoluted and kind of funny through its complexity quote of Lacan. He says, "I am thinking where I am not. Therefore, I am where I am not thinking." These words render palpable to an attentive ear within what elusive ambiguity the ring of meaning flees from our grasp along the verbal string. Right? This is the kind of stuff where my meaning of what I really wanted to say is kind of always, as soon as it comes out of my mouth, it is diluted in the social world. And I'm always trying to recover that genuine meaning, even to myself, of what did I really mean when I said that? Right? He says, what we must say is, and this is the real convoluted part, I am not, where I am the plaything of my thought. I think about what I am, where I do not think I am thinking. And this is the hidden part, the sort of hermetically sealed part of Lacan. That where I don't think I'm thinking is where the actual agency of my thoughts and actions is coming from, namely my unconscious. And this is always barred. This always leads to a barred subject, where the subject is trying to recover himself, for example, through his desires, which always project out of himself something that will make him complete, make him or her what they are, but precisely by recognizing the emptiness that defines what it is to be a social being, the holes that define what it means to project myself into the future and why I do it in the first place. A really helpful chapter in Ecrits is the instance of the letter in the unconscious, where he basically gives us his theory of language and signification and how this works. And I recommend you read this because it's hard for me to really articulate in a summary manner the entirety of this. But he says that the major theme of this science, his sort of linguistics of the unconscious, is thus based in effect on the primordial position of the signifier and the signified as distinct orders initially separated by a barrier resisting signification. Right? There is always something between what I am to myself and what I am socially. And I'm always trying to reconcile these with each other, but precisely insofar as I am barred. And I need someone to recognize myself as I fully am, recognize all my intricacies, thus the importance of, friendship, love, genuine connections. You can see all the sort of stuff that you didn't want to tell people accepted, actualized, validated, right? But this barrier is always going to be there. I can never fully come to be one with my lover. As much as it's said that, through marriage, you become one flesh, that's not true. You will never become one with the other, because then they wouldn't be the other anymore. They would be you. This would be the totalitarian subject in Hegel's master-slave dialectic. You lose your individuality. You lose your agency. You lose what it is to be you. As such, we must maintain this dialectic of self or subject and other or world. And we must do this by getting past the great paradox that comes with this barrier, right? He says that no signification can be sustained except by reference to another signification, right? Because if I want to talk about the in itself, the signifier prior to its mediation, the only thing I can do that with is by talking about another signifier which has yet to be mediated before its dilution. So, you can do this with like logic, for example, where you can talk about a priori statements that need not have any empirical content or empirical referent. I can say a triangle has 3 sides, and that's true a priori, regardless of whether or not I'm looking at something triangular in the world, right? This is just an axiomatic truth. And these axioms are different signifiers within a given geometric system, right? So in the same way, this primary language consists of a number of signifiers which we have to kind of walk back from the way that they're uttered through speech to what they were before that mediation, which is, of course, quite the challenge, right? As a result, he says, the signifier, by its very nature, always anticipates meaning by deploying its dimension in some sense before it. As is seen at the level of the sentence when the latter is interrupted before the significant term. I'll never... ... The fact remains... ... Still, perhaps... ... Such sentences nevertheless make sense, and that sense is all the more oppressive in that it is content to make us wait for it. Right? So we can still have some sort of liminal meaning whereby the fullness of the meaning of the statement is deferred. You can have this ... where I say, the fact remains, or still perhaps, or therefore. And right, if I just say therefore, maybe if we've been talking about something already, you can kind of anticipate maybe what I'm going to say. If I say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore, if you have some logic skills, Socrates is mortal, right? So this meaning can be deferred into the future, such that the meaning almost comes before its instantiation in reality. There's that virtual mention, which can kind of shine through prior to its realization. And with something like the judge saying, I declare thee guilty, that literally is a sort of blinding shining through whereby you're blinded by the truth of the master, right? Lacan says, whence we can say that it is in the chain of the signifier that meaning insists, but that none of the chain's elements consists in the signification it can provide at that very moment. This is an incessant sliding of the signified under the signifier. And that is a challenging concept right there, where the signifier is always being hidden and kind of elided by the way in which it is instantiated, by the signifieds that it refers to, where we try to, for example, get really specific so that we can get back to some pre-signified signifier. And that is, of course, the great challenge for Lacan that I really don't know what to make of it. It's quite a paradoxical situation where we're trying to find some systematic way to talk about neuroses and phantasms and dreams and hallucinations and all this stuff. But hopefully this is enough of a primer to understand the importance of language to Lacan's schema, to his philosophy, the way in which the unconscious is a language and whatnot. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, especially not this one, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.